Welcome to Tranquility, a podcast dedicated to slowing down, quieting the noise of the day, and helping you find a sense of peace. I'm John Coverstone, and each episode is a gentle invitation to unwind, whether you're settling in for the night, taking a moment to breathe, or simply looking for a calm space in your day. So find a comfortable place, let your thoughts drift, and allow yourself to relax. This is Tranquility. By late afternoon, the orchard had begun to soften. The light was still clear, though it no longer had the bright, direct feel of midday. It had turned more gentle by then. It came in at a lower angle, slipping between the branches in long, pale bands, lying gold across the grass and the worn paths between the rows. Here and there, where leaves still held to the trees, that light rested on them for a moment and made them seem almost thin enough to glow. Silas came through the side gate with one hand on the latch until it settled back in place. He always did that. The gate would swing shut on its own, but if he let it go too soon, it would strike the post with a hard wooden knock, and that sound never seemed to suit the hour. So he kept his hand on it, eased it in, and waited for the small click of the iron catch. Then he stood still for a moment and looked ahead. From the gate, the orchard sloped very slightly downward, not enough to notice all at once, but enough that the far rows seemed to sink into the land. The trees were old and well-spaced, each with its own spread of branch and shape of trunk, and between them ran narrow lanes of grass worn smooth by boots, baskets, barrows, and many slow seasons of use. Some trees still carried fruit, though not much now. Most of the harvest had already been brought in. What remained had been left on purpose or missed by chance. A few late apples hidden under leaves, a few small pears turned pale and sweet in the cool air. Silas breathed in, and the orchard met him the way it always did. There was the faint scent of apples in the grass, not sharp now, but soft and settled. There was leaf mold and bark and the clean smell that rises when the day begins to cool. Beneath it all, there was earth, dark and steady. He could smell the boards of the nearby shed, too, warmed from hours of sun, though the warmth was already beginning to leave them. He started down the first row at an easy pace. His boots pressed lightly into the ground. The grass was dry on top, but beneath that it still held a trace of coolness. Fallen leaves had gathered in thin patches along the roots and around the stones at the path's edge. When he stepped through them, they made only a low sound, more of a soft shifting than a crisp crackle. The leaves were past that bright stage now. They had relaxed into themselves. Some were brown, some dull gold, some a faded copper that deepened where the shadows lay. He carried a small wicker basket. No, he didn't. That'd be funny. He carried a small wicker basket in one hand. It was not empty, though it was nearly so. Inside were a pair of work gloves, a folded cloth, and a short length of twine. There was room for whatever he found as he went, and that was enough. At this stage in the season, he no longer came out with large plans. The day's work was not to gather everything. That part was done. What remained was lighter and slower. He walked the rows, checked the trees, took what was ready, noted what needed tending, and let the orchard tell him, in its quiet way, what the evening required. A breeze moved through from the western side and passed over the tops of the trees first. He could hear it before he felt it. It touched the upper branches in a long, thin whisper, and then came down among the trunks, cooler there, with the scent of open fields beyond the stone wall. A few leaves loosened and drifted across the lane ahead of him. One turned slowly as it fell and came to rest against the toe of his boot. Silas bent to pick up a windfall from the grass near the first tree. It was small and freckled, with one side bruised from the drop. He turned it once in his hand and set it aside near the roots where the ground sloped. Later, something small would find it. That, too, was part of the evening. He placed a hand on the trunk before moving on. The bark was cool and rough, ridged in long lines that widened lower down where the tree had thickened with age. He knew these trunks well, though he did not think of that knowledge as anything remarkable. After enough years, the hand simply came to rest where it had rested before. He knew which trees leaned a little after rain, which ones put out blossom first in spring, which ones held fruit high and late. He knew where the limbs curved low enough to duck under without thought. He knew the places where moss took hold, and the places where lichen made pale, map-like marks over the bark. At the third tree, he found 2 apples still hanging together near the center of the canopy. They had been hidden behind a fold of leaves in a crossing branch, easy to miss if one were walking quickly. He stepped closer, set the basket down, and reached in. The leaves brushed his sleeve as he lifted his arm. One apple came free with a small turn, then the second. Both were cool from the shade. He polished them lightly on the cloth and placed them side by side in the basket. Then he stood there a moment longer than he needed to, looking up through the branches. From below, the shape of the tree changed. The crown opened into interwoven lines, darker where branch crossed branch, brighter where the sky showed through. The remaining leaves trembled with the breeze, making small, uncertain flashes of light. Beyond them, the sky had begun to pale toward evening. It was still blue, though not that wide, bright blue of noon. This was gentler, with a faint silver near the horizon, and a warm lingering above the far field where the sun would lower soon. He moved on. The orchard always seemed larger when he walked it at this hour. In the morning, work gave everything a clear proportion. There were tasks to begin, tools to gather, places to reach, but by late afternoon the distances lengthened. The rows seemed to draw out softly ahead of him, not in a way that felt far, only in a way that invited time. Each tree became a small stop of its own. Each patch of shade held him for a moment. Even the light between the rows felt like part of the path. A blackbird lifted from somewhere near the fence and crossed low in front of him. He watched it pass between 2 trunks and vanish toward the hedgerow. After that, the orchard grew quiet again, though not empty of sound. It was never truly silent. There was always some small motion in it, a leaf turning loose, a stem brushing against dry grass, a distant hinge from the barn. The faintest settling of apples in a wooden crate from somewhere beyond the shed wall where the day's picking had been stacked. Silas reached the middle rows and paused beside one of the older pear trees. These stood a little taller than the apples, and their branches held a more upright shape, though the oldest among them had eased outward over time. The pears were nearly all gone, but he found one remaining on a low branch to his right. It was narrow at the neck and broad below, green faded toward yellow, with a blush of brown where the sun had touched it through the week. He cupped it gently in his hand and lifted. It came loose, without resistance. That easy release pleased him. Fruit should never be forced from the tree at this stage. If it held fast, it wasn't ready. If it came away with a soft turn and almost no effort, then the tree had already made its decision. Silas liked to work with that feeling, the sense that some things could be finished by simply meeting them at the right moment. He set the pear in the basket beside the apples and continued down the lane. The shed stood near the center of the orchard where 4 paths met. It was a plain little structure, built of weathered boards silvered by years of sun and rain. One side had ivy low along the base, though not enough to do harm. Beside it sat a bench made from long oak plank laid over 2 stone supports. Silas passed it without sitting. He wasn't ready for the pause yet. The body had its own sense of timing in work like this, and his still wanted motion. So he kept walking, angling into the eastern rows where the trees were younger and more evenly shaped. Their trunks were not yet thick, their branches not yet heavy with the twists that time would give them. He liked these rows in the evening. The light came through them in a cleaner way. Their shadows fell long and fine over the grass, and the fruit that remained was easier to spot. He found 3 more apples there, 1 on a high branch, 2 hidden low behind a fork in the trunk. To reach the high one, he rose onto the balls of his feet and extended his arm until the tips of his fingers touched the stem. Do that again. To reach the high one, he rose onto the balls of his feet and extended his arm until the tips of his fingers touched the stem. The branch dipped slightly under his hand. The apple turned once, then came away. He smiled a little as he lowered it. It was a small thing, and yet there was always some quiet satisfaction in not needing the ladder. A little farther on, he saw where rabbits had been at the edge of the row. The grass there had been pressed into 2 narrow runs leading out toward the wall. He crouched for a closer look, resting his basket on one knee. The ground was marked with light impressions, small and clean. Nothing fresh enough to follow, only signs that the orchard remained what it had always been. Tended, yes, but shared. When he stood again, he did so slowly, with the ease of someone who had learned not to hurry the body where there was no reason to. The breeze moved once more through the trees, and this time he felt it fully. It touched his cheek and slipped beneath the collar of his coat. The day had turned another small degree. The warmth was thinning. Dusk was not near yet, but it had begun to gather itself somewhere just beyond the hour. He walked toward the far wall where the orchard met the meadow. From there the land opened into a longer view. A pasture lay beyond, then a line of poplars, and beyond those the roofs of 2 distant houses low against the rise. Smoke lifted from one chimney in a pale straight line before drifting. Silas stopped at the wall and rested his hand on the top stone. The stone held the day's last warmth. He stood there for a while, not thinking of anything in particular, only looking. The meadow grass moved in uneven waves where the breeze crossed it. A few late insects hovered over the taller stems near the wall, catching the light when they turned. Somewhere beyond the poplars, a dog barked once, then no more. The sound came faint and round through the evening air. Behind him, the orchard waited in its patient order. He turned back to it after a minute and began another row, this time more slowly than before. The basket was still light, though no longer empty. The apples rested together at the bottom with the pear beside them, shifting only slightly as he walked. Their soft weight marked the hour better than any clock could have. It was the kind of measure he trusted, the gradual filling of a basket, the cooling of the air, the lengthening of shadow from trunk to trunk. At one tree he noticed a broken twig caught in a lower branch. He set down the basket, reached up, and eased it free. At another he brushed away a curl of dead vine that had climbed too far along the bark. At a third, he bent to gather a scatter of fallen leaves from around the base where damp had collected near the roots. None of it was difficult work. It was only the sort of care that came from paying attention over many seasons. The sunlight had grown softer still by the time he came again to the center path. The boards of the shed no longer held their earlier glow. The bench beside it had fallen half into shadow. Silas set the basket down there at last and sat. For a few moments, he did nothing at all. He rested his hands on his knees and let his breathing settle into the stillness around him. The orchard spread in all directions from that point, row after row, each one touched by the same slow hour. From where he sat, he could see leaves moving high up in the western light, their undersides pale when they turned. He could hear a faint tapping from somewhere near the barn, perhaps a loose piece of wood shifting as the air cooled. Closer by, there was only the low brush of grass and the very soft sound of one apple settling against another in the basket. He reached up, picked up the pear, and turned it once in his hand. The skin was smooth apart from one rough patch near the stem. He held it to his nose and caught the mild green scent of it, clean and faintly sweet. Then he set it back with the others and leaned against the wall of the shed, tilting his head just enough to look up at the sky through the nearest branches. The evening was opening slowly. There was no need to rush ahead of it. After a while, Silas rose again, took up the basket, and stepped back into the rows. When Silas stepped back into the rows, the light had lowered just enough that the shapes of things began to soften at their edges. It was not a sudden change. Nothing in the orchard ever shifted that way. The difference came slowly, almost without notice, until he found that the shadows no longer held sharp lines, and the spaces between the trees had taken on a quiet, even tone. The gold of the afternoon had eased into something more muted, a pale amber that rested lightly over the grass and along the trunks. He moved along the next row at an unhurried pace, the basket steady in his hand. The work resumed as it had before, though now it seemed to carry a gentler rhythm. Reach, turn, lift, place. A few more apples came free where they had been left behind the first pass of the harvest. One was tucked low near the base of a branch that curved outward before rising again. Another hung alone near the outer edge of the tree, catching what remained of the sun. Each one he handled the same way. He turned it once, felt the small give at the stem, and let it come free without effort. Then he brushed it lightly against the cloth before setting it into the basket. There was no need to hurry, and so he did not. The orchard gave what it had, and he took only what was ready. A breeze moved through again, softer now, less certain. It passed across the tops of the trees and then settled among them, as if it had lost some of its distance on the way. The leaves answered with a low, even sound, not a rustle so much as a quiet shifting. It came and went in slow intervals, leaving stillness behind it that felt fuller than before. Silas paused near the end of the row and looked down toward the ground. There, near a shallow dip in the grass, he saw a small cluster of apples that had fallen together. Some had split where they struck the earth, their pale flesh exposed. Others lay intact, though marked by soft, dark patches where the skin had given way. He crouched, setting the basket beside him, and gathered two that were still firm enough to keep. The rest he left where they were. He placed them slightly apart from one another, not from any strict habit, but from a quiet sense that they should not be piled. The orchard had its own way of using what fell. In time, these would soften into the ground or be found by something that passed through in the early hours before dawn. It was not something he needed to manage. It was only something to notice. When he stood again, he did so with a slower motion than before, and remained still for a moment once upright. The air had cooled another degree. It rested lightly against his face and along his hands, no longer warmed by the day. He drew a breath and held it for a second, then let it go, watching as the orchard extended quietly around him. The far rows had begun to settle into a more uniform tone, their individual shapes still clear though less defined at the edges. He turned and made his way toward the shed. This time, when he reached the bench, he did not pass by it. He set the basket down first, placing it near the end where the wood remained faintly warm. Then he went to the shed door and opened it just enough to reach inside. The hinges gave a low, familiar sound, softened by use. Within, the air held a different scent. Dry wood, coiled rope, the faint trace of old apples stored there earlier in the season. He took out the small tin cup and a narrow flask. Closing the door again, he returned to the bench and sat, pouring a little water into the cup. He drank slowly, not from thirst so much as habit, and from the way a pause like this seemed to settle the body more fully into the hour. For a while he remained there, holding the cup loosely between his hands. From this place, the orchard felt gathered rather than spread. The rows came in toward him from all sides, their lines converging softly at the center. The trees nearest the shed stood in quiet balance, their branches reaching just far enough that they did not crowd one another, their shadows now long enough to overlap in places along the ground. A bird moved somewhere above him, shifting from one branch to another. He did not look up at once. The sound was enough on its own, a small motion in the larger stillness. When he did glance upward, he saw only the brief outline of it before it settled out of sight among the leaves. The light continued to ease downward. It no longer fell in clear bands between the trees. Instead, it rested evenly across the orchard, as though it had spread itself thin in preparation for the evening. The color of it had shifted again, carrying less warmth now, more of a quiet neutrality that lay gently over everything it touched. Silas set the cup aside and leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. The basket sat near his feet, the apples and pear within it now forming a small uneven layer across the bottom. He reached down and adjusted them slightly, not out of necessity, only from a habit of order. The movement was slow, careful, without any sense of urgency. After a time, he stood again. The pause had been enough. The body, once rested, seemed ready to move once more, though at a pace that matched the evening rather than the day. He took up the basket and walked out along the western rows. Here the light lingered a little longer. It came through the trees at a low angle, catching the edges of branches and the sides of trunks that faced the open field. Where it touched the bark, it brought out a faint warmth in the color, a soft glow that would fade soon enough, but remain for now. He moved from tree to tree, not stopping at each one, only where something drew his attention. At one he noticed a length of twine that had been left from earlier in the season, tied loosely around a lower branch to support it under the weight of the fruit. The branch had long since risen again free of that burden. He untied the twine and coiled it neatly, placing it into the basket. At another, he brushed his hand along the trunk where a patch of lichen had spread in a pale pattern. The surface there felt different under his fingers, smoother in some places, slightly raised in others. He paused just long enough to feel the texture, then let his hand fall away. Further on, he found a single apple resting high up in the branches, just within reach if he stepped close and extended his arm. He did so carefully, placing one foot forward then the other until he stood underneath it. The branch dipped slightly as he reached up, the leaves brushing against the sleeve of his coat. His fingers found the fruit, cool and firm, and with a small turn it came free. He held it for a moment at eye level. The skin carried a faint pattern of red over yellow, softened by the dimming light. It was not perfect, though it did not need to be. He turned it once, then set it into the basket with the others. The orchard had grown quieter still. The distant sounds that had carried earlier in the afternoon, the faint movements from the barn, the occasional call from beyond the fields, had eased away. What remained was closer, more contained. The soft shift of leaves, the almost silent press of his steps in the grass, the light movement of the basket as it brushed against his leg. He reached the far end of the row and turned back. From this angle, the shed stood partially hidden among the trees, its shape broken by the trunks that lay between. The bench beside it was now fully in shadow. The paths that crossed there were still visible, though less distinct, their edges blending into the surrounding grass. He began to make his way toward it once more, though not directly. Instead, he followed a gentle curve through the rows, passing by trees he had already checked, seeing them again in the altered light. They seemed different now, though nothing about them had changed. It was only the hour that had shifted, and with it, the way the orchard revealed itself. At one of the last trees before the center path, he paused again. There was nothing in particular that had drawn him to stop. It was simply the place where his steps slowed and then ceased, as though the orchard itself had marked that moment. He stood there, the basket hanging loosely at his side, and let his gaze move upward through the branches. The sky beyond them had deepened slightly, the pale silver at the horizon giving way to a soft, even blue that would soon darken further. The first hint of evening rested there, not yet dim, only quieter, more settled. A single leaf loosened above him and drifted down. It moved slowly, turning once, then again, before coming to rest on the grass near his foot. He watched it land, then lowered his gaze and remained where he was for another moment, listening. There was very little to hear, and yet the orchard did not feel empty. It felt complete. After a time, Silas drew a breath, shifted the basket in his hand, and stepped back onto the center path. The work of the day was nearly done. The rest would belong to the fading light and to the quiet that followed it. By the time Silas reached the center path again, the evening had settled into a quieter shape. The light remained, though it no longer seemed to come from any one place. It rested low across the orchard, thin and even, touching the tops of the grass and the sides of the trunks without casting a shadow. The color of it had cooled, carrying only a faint warmth where it lingered along the western edge of... I'll start reading ahead better. The color of it had cooled, carrying only a faint warmth where it lingered along the western edge beyond the trees. He did not turn into another row. Instead, he walked slowly past the shed, the basket light in his hand, and followed the path that led along the inner edge of the orchard. It curved gently, keeping the trees close on one side, and the open meadow just beyond the low stone wall on the other. He had taken that path many times before at the end of the day. It marked a quiet close to the work, a way of letting the orchard fall behind him in small, unhurried measure. His steps were softer now. The ground held a deeper coolness, and the leaves between his boots gave less sound than they had earlier. Where they had shifted in dry layers before, they now seemed to rest more fully against the earth, their edges softened by the evening air. Each step pressed lightly, then lifted without a trace. A faint breeze moved once more along the wall. It came from the meadow this time, carrying the open scent of grass and the distant trace of soil turned somewhere beyond sight. It passed through the orchard at a lower height, brushing the trunks, stirring only the lowest branches. The higher leaves remained still. Silas slowed as he walked, though not by intent. The pace came of its own accord, guided by the hour. There was no reason to move quickly, no task left that required it. The work had already settled into the basket he carried, into the small adjustments made along the rows, into the quiet attention given to each tree. What remained was simply to walk and to let the orchard rest as the light continued to fade. He reached a place where the stone wall dipped slightly, the ground on either side worn smooth by years of passing. There he stopped and set the basket down beside him. The apples and the pear lay together at the bottom, their surfaces dim now in the softened light. He adjusted them once more, though they didn't need it, then rested his hand lightly along the rim of the basket and looked out over the meadow. The field had taken on a single tone, its earlier movement now less visible. The grass no longer showed each shift of the breeze. Instead, it seemed to hold a steady stillness, broken only in small places where the land dipped or rose. Beyond it, the light of trees stood in darker form against the sky, their details merging into a single edge. The sky itself had deepened. The pale silver that had rested near the horizon was gone now, replaced by a calm, even blue that carried no sharpness. It did not draw the eye upward. It simply remained, quiet and wide, holding the last of the day without effort. Silas stood there for a while, one hand resting on the stone, the other near the basket at his side. He did not think of the hours that had passed, or of the ones to come. There was no need to measure them. The orchard had its own way of marking time, and he had moved within it long enough that the measure had become familiar. The light would fade, the air would cool, the sounds would lessen. That was enough to know. After a few minutes, he lifted the basket again and turned back toward the shed. The path curved inward, drawing him once more among the trees. As he walked, the orchard seemed to close gently around him, not in a way that felt confined, only in a way that felt complete. The rows no longer stretched outward in long lines. They gathered closer now, their shapes softened, their spaces filled with a quiet, even shade. He passed the bench without stopping. It had grown darker there, the wood no longer holding any trace of the day's warmth. The shed stood beside it in still outline, its boards now a uniform tone. The door remained as he had left it, closed and resting lightly in its frame. Silas set the basket down near the wall of the shed and stepped a short distance away. From here he could see the orchard in its evening state. The individual leaves were no longer distinct unless he looked closely. The branches formed broader lines, their finer details settling into the whole. The paths between the rows were still visible, though they no longer held clear edges. They seemed to blend into the grass, becoming a part of the orchard rather than separate from it. A small sound came from somewhere deeper among the trees. It was slight, almost uncertain. Perhaps a leaf falling, perhaps something moving quietly through the lower branches. Silas listened for a moment, though the sound did not come again. The orchard held it briefly, then returned to its steady stillness. He took a slow breath. The air had cooled enough now that it carried a clearer scent of earth. The sweetness of the fruit had faded into the background, leaving something more neutral, more grounded. It was the scent of the orchard as it settled for the night. He turned and opened the shed door once more. The hinge moved with the same low sound as before. Inside, the dimness had deepened, though there was still enough light to see the shapes of tools resting along the wall, the coils of rope, the empty crates stacked near the back. He stepped just inside, set the basket down on the wooden floor, and stood there for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the change. The space held a quiet of its own. It was not separate from the orchard, only sheltered from it. The sounds from outside came in softened, reduced to a faint presence. The air was still, carrying the dry scent of wood and the memory of earlier work. He closed the door gently behind him, leaving it not quite latched. Then he moved back toward the entrance and stepped outside again. The light had dimmed further in that brief time. The sky now carried the first hint of deeper blue, and along the far edge, beyond the trees, there was a faint suggestion of gray where the last light withdrew. The orchard had settled into near stillness. The breeze had fallen away. The leaves no longer moved. Silas stood beside the shed, his hands resting loosely at his sides. There was nothing more to do. The work had been simple, and it had come to its end without effort. The orchard would remain as it was through the night, holding its quiet order until morning returned. The trees would stand as they had stood. The fruit that remained would rest where it hung, or where it had fallen, and the paths would wait, unchanged. He looked once more along the nearest row. The trunks stood in even spacing, their shapes now only gently defined. The ground between them held a uniform shade, broken here and there by the faint outline of a fallen leaf. Beyond that, the rest of the orchard extended in the same calm pattern, fading gradually into the dimness. He turned toward the side gate. The path leading to it was familiar underfoot, though now it seemed shorter than before, as though the evening had drawn everything inward. His steps remained slow, measured, each one placed without sound. When he reached the gate, he set his hand on the latch. He paused there, just as he had when he entered, though now the orchard lay behind him. For a moment, he did not move. The quiet of the place rested fully around him, not asking anything, not offering anything beyond what it had already given. It was enough to stand there, to feel the stillness, to let the last of the light settle without interruption. Then he eased the gate open. The hinge moved with a soft, familiar motion. He stepped through, turned slightly, and guided it closed behind him with the same care as before. The wood met the post without sound. The latch fell into place with a small, gentle click. Silas stood for a moment on the outside of the orchard. From here, the trees formed a single darkened shape against the evening sky. The details within them had faded, leaving only the outline of the place he had walked, the space that had held the day's work. He rested his hand briefly on the top of the gate. Then he let it fall. Turning away, he followed the narrow path that led from the orchard toward the house beyond the rise. The ground there was even, the way clear though dim. With each step, the orchard receded behind him, not lost, only set aside until morning. The air grew cooler as he moved on. The sounds of the orchard faded, replaced by the quiet of the open land. There was little to hear now, only the soft movement of his steps and the distant, steady calm of the evening settling in. He did not look back again. The path carried him forward at the same unhurried pace, the light continuing to fade around him, the sky deepening above. And after a time, even the outline of the orchard was no longer visible, though its stillness seemed to remain, held somewhere just beyond the dark, steady and unchanged. Silas walked on, and the evening closed gently behind him. Thank you for spending this quiet time with me. If you enjoyed the story, I hope you'll join me again for another moment of tranquility. For now, may this peaceful feeling stay with you as you drift off to sleep or continue to enjoy your time of relaxation. Until next time.